Well, yesterday I spent a lot of time talking about the Roman soldiers, how they were trained to plant their feet, their spikes into the ground and to hold their ground and to withstand the onslaughts, the attacks, the charges of the enemies. And it was through their steadfastness and through their self-discipline that they were able to hold the ground. And basically, it's amazing because those who study these things have said that usually an attacking army only had enough energy to hit them about 3 times, and then they would begin to pull back and exhaustion would set in. So you can imagine the amount of adrenaline flow and that you're charging against your enemy and you hit them as hard as you can, and suddenly you find that your enemy doesn't move, but he holds his ground. You do it again, and you begin exhausted. And what happened, it's interesting in the Roman military conflicts, is that they knew that after about 3 of those charges being sustained, they, in a very disciplined way, would have the soldiers in the rear move up to the front. And they would have like 3 or 4 layers of soldiers who would replace each other with fresh men. And that was a part of their victory against their enemies because they were allowed to get refreshed, so that the enemy would keep on throwing the same guys against them and would eventually become exhausted, where they were always putting refreshed people in the front. Which kind of brings me to a little bit different topic, really, in a way, is that in the battle that we fight, there needs to be times of refreshment and also times of celebration. I found that I was raised in a family where relaxation was not encouraged. How do I put it? My parents felt that an idle mind was a devil workshop, and that the way they lived their life was they worked almost incessantly. I remember my mom was always doing something. Even when we were sitting around watching TV, we'd watch the Ed Sullivan Show and Lawrence Welk as kids. Some of you remember those. And even then, my mom would be back there sewing something or stitching something or doing something that always had to have her hands busy and working. So I grew up with this idea that idle time was wasted time. And it took me a long time to realize that sometimes my soul just needs to be refreshed. Sometimes my body needs to rest. My mind needs to rest. But my soul needs to rest, to be still and know that He is God. That there's times when we need to just really pull back from the fray of everyday life. You may be going through some really intense things. And it's at those times where you need to be able to pull back and simply say, God, I just pray that you would restore my soul, that you'd refresh me in the things of your Spirit, and enable you to begin to continue in the battle. Because I find that many people fail from the fatigue of constant, unending, and ceasing conflict. And this is why, secondarily, it's really important to have people that you can talk to and trust. And I say that with a degree of advisement, if you will, because, you just don't tell everybody everything about what's going on in your life, because not everybody is mature enough to handle some of the information you might give them. What I hear more commonly from people is, well, I shared with somebody about what I was going through, and they just kind of backed away and said, well, good luck with that. Have a great day, and I'll pray for you. And then they walk away because they don't want to get really kind of entangled in your stuff. And I don't completely disagree or misunderstand that. But at the same time, all of us need to have people who we feel like we can entrust the difficult moments in our life. And I found that increasingly in this day and age, where people are more and more isolating themselves technologically, if you will, that we can communicate at a distance. We don't have to do it personally or intimately, that there's a certain, not only loneliness that sets in, but quite honestly, many people have nobody in their life whom they can talk to. It's interesting. A friend of my wife was sharing with her that she had to go talk to the doctor about tremendous stresses in her personal life, and she does have tremendous stresses, and keeps her right at the top of our prayer list on a regular basis. But she was telling the doctor and asking him if there was something he could prescribe or help or encourage that wouldn't blur her brain, and I don't think there was. But she made the comment to the physician that, well, she said, you need to go talk to a counselor. And she said, well, I have a friend that I can talk to all the time and share all this stuff, which happened to be my wife. And and he said, keep that friend. Keep that friend. And I thought it was really interesting because what he was saying is that most people don't have somebody like that in their life. Someone who seems to understand what they're going through, what they're dealing with, what they're struggling with. I admit that I try to be really fairly transparent and honest. I mean, I don't work at putting effort into trying to make these broadcasts, real polished or anything. For one reason, that just takes a lot of time and work and energy that I don't have. But secondarily, I'm real and I'm like you. You know, I go through the same kind of stuff and struggle with things just like you do. There's really nothing that has befallen my life and that hasn't been experienced by you as well. And I think it's encouraging when we find out that other people go through things just like us. And so part of the key of being able to stand firm in the faith is because he says, you know that your brothers throughout the world are going through the same kind of sufferings. And that's the thing I think is so important, that we realize that whatever you're thinking and whatever you're feeling, whatever you're dealing with, there are people in your circle who are going through exactly the same things. And who, if you had a chance to say, this is what I'm dealing with, and just even to ask people, would you just kind of remember me in a quick prayer sometime about this because I'm going through this, you'll find that you'll come across people saying, I've been there, I've experienced exactly like that. I know exactly what you're thinking, what you're feeling. I know the fear, the exhaustion, the fatigue, the unbelief that comes in, the guilt and the shame and all the rest that come with those things. There are people around you who are going through exactly the same thing. And that's why what Paul responds to this in much the same way as Peter did, because I love this word stand firm, this phrase stand firm. It's something that Paul repeats. We find that Peter repeats it, several times in this letter, but because that's the key thing, isn't not just taking ground for the kingdom, it's holding the ground that God has given us. It's one of those kind of things that God takes ground for the kingdom by the grace of God, by the power of God. We don't really take any ground. We don't convert anybody. We don't change anybody. We don't, what we do is really kind of something that happens through us, not because of us. And so when it comes to really reaching the world for Christ and winning people over and doing the kingdom work that we often talk about, it's really allowing the grace of God, the Spirit of God, to work in you so that he can work through you. But I've found over and over again that just in offhanded conversations with people that I've shared something with them that they say is, wow, this is exactly what I needed to hear. And in fact, I hear that from some of you many times, and these who have listened to these dailies that you've shared with me. And it's really encouraging, saying, when you shared this today, it really was exactly what I needed to hear at this particular moment in time in my life. And I don't like to take credit for that because it's not me. I don't know what's going on. All I know is what's going on inside of me and how God has spoken to me. And I feel impelled many times just to share what is on my heart. And again, that's the Holy Spirit working in his people, through his people. And what we need to do is not so much be a force out there for the kingdom as it is to simply hold on to what God has given us. I think when Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 15:58, stand firm. The word firm there literally means to be kind of sedentary. Don't let yourself be moved. Be like a rock that can't be moved. He says, and let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord because you know that your labor is not in vain. In other words, he's just saying, hold the ground that God has given you. Hold on to the faith that he's given you. Hold on to what God has told you. My pastor used to always say, when you don't know what to do, just go back to the last instructions God gave you. Just go back to the last thing he told you and stay there and hang on to that, because that will really be probably the moment that you're in this moment. And he wants you just to stand firm. And in fact, I love the way Paul, in writing to the Ephesians, kind of reiterated this. In verse 11, he said of chapter 6, he says, take your stand. Again, the idea of the Roman soldier being fixed in his position and against the devil's schemes. He says, the devil's going to throw stuff at you. He's going to fiery darts. He's going to fling at you. Just stand your ground and don't let him knock you off balance. Because what he wants you to do is run and flee in terror. to give up what God has accomplished in your life. I think about people who are going through relational conflicts and difficulties, marriages and stuff, and how the enemy oftentimes comes up and says, just write it off, give up and quit. Don't try anymore because they'll never change, and on it goes. And I've even felt that way in praying for certain people. You pray and you pray and you pray, and you don't see any alteration or fixation. And God says, just continue to do what you know to do until I tell you what to do next. And that's what he says. I love this, how Paul says this 3 times. He says, not only take your stand, but in verse 13, he says, stand your ground. And then he says, after you've done everything, to stand. And then he reiterates again, stand firm. So it's really important that we not give up the ground that God has given to us, and that we remain steadfast in believing that God is going to do exceeding abundantly above and beyond all that we think or ask. And that whether we get a reward or a blessing or even an answer in this life is really secondary to the fact that the less we know and the less we receive in this life, the more we will receive when we find ourselves home with the Lord. Well, I'll catch up with you tomorrow. God bless you. Go in his grace.